Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Inside the Minds of Business Alchemists, hosted by me, Phil Akilade. This is our maiden voyage, our first episode. And on today's episode, I've got my good friend and old buddy, Mr. Michael Hill. Before I introduce Mike, let me say a few quick words as to what this podcast is all about. Just a few months ago, I had a client, and this client was talking about a new way of doing business. And as I was listening to her, I was thinking, wow, that's like magic. She's taken this idea from the ether and turned it into a brand new business. And it got me thinking as to what entrepreneurs really are. And I think of entrepreneurs as magicians, as alchemists. And so the idea of Inside the Minds of Business Alchemists came about. And I wanted to try to invite people who are doing some great things in the world of business. And the first person that came to my mind is this old buddy of mine, Mr. Michael Hill. He's the founder of One Planet Pizza. So we're going to chat with Mike in this session and find out all about what he does, how he thinks, and what we can learn from him as a business alchemist. So, Mike, first of all, welcome.
Morning, Phil. How are you today?
Yeah, very good. Very good. Thank you.
Excellent.
Now, I've given you a very, very quick introduction. Probably best if I don't say too much and if I just ask you, because before you started One Planet Pizza, you were already a successful entrepreneur, a successful business owner. You had a consultancy business, didn't you? So tell us a little bit about that quickly, and then tell us why you decided to start all over again and set up this brand new business.
Okay, Phil. So I guess it all comes back, it goes back about 25 years. Now, in fact, my first business is its 25th anniversary this year. And originally my expertise was very much in what we call the active leisure sector. So think health clubs, ice rinks, leisure centres, things like this. I used to manage them, travelled around the country, setting them up and launching various facilities, public and private sector. Then 25 years ago, I thought I really want to focus on customer insight and the customer experience, because that's what really drives me, gets me excited, gets me out of bed in the morning. So I set up a consultancy, which was focusing on measuring customer insight and helping people to deliver exceptional service. And that's been reasonably successful. It's still going on now. I'm standing back a little bit from that. But yeah, we work with hundreds of leisure centres, health clubs, and with government, national government, local government in that business. But I guess one of the things it didn't bring me was that real sense of purpose. One of the key sort of things I'm interested in is people eating healthy plant-based diets, which are better for them, better for the planet, and obviously better for animals, because the plant-based diet I'm talking about is essentially a vegan diet. And I wanted to do something that would encourage more people to eat more plant-based foods. Absolutely loved pizza as a food. Wanted to do something with my son, Joe, who had graduated and had been working for a couple of years for a local charity. His degree is in psychology, so he was doing counselling work. But with my experience of setting up a business, I was about late 30s when I set up my first business. I was really keen for him to try and experience that a little bit earlier. So we got together and did a bit of market research, discovered that plant-based food was definitely expanding in popularity. This was 6-7 years ago, and that no one was doing a really good tasting, high quality, frozen, vegan or plant-based business. So that's where One Planet Pizza originally came from.
Wow. Okay. So really it was born out of, was the drive your purpose, or was the drive I just want to start making pizzas and get them out there, would you say?
Yeah. No, it was definitely the purpose. It was sometimes I call pizzas an agent of change.
Oh,
So everyone, in terms of what we're trying to do here, is change people's perception of their diet and the food that they consume. And pizza is one of the most popular fast foods around the whole world. And it's really interesting that even during these last couple of years with the cost of living crisis, one of the most resilient sectors within food or categories within food has been frozen. And within frozen pizza has been really resilient. It hasn't suffered. And there's a reason for that. It's incredibly convenient. People love pizza. They can buy them, put them in the freezers, etc., etc. So it seemed a really good, fun food to try and create a fantastic plant-based alternative to those classic flavors. And what we've ended up with is a very small range. It's very easy when you love food and you set up a food business to go crazy on your MPD and to just think, because everyone loves creating new things. But what we've discovered over the last 5 years really is that 90% of pizzas sold fall into 4 or 5 flavors. So let's just focus on those and just make sure that we're really good at producing those 4 flavors. So we've ended up with 4 classic flavors.
You mentioned, before we come on to the flavors, but you mentioned, you said a word there, you said MPD. Did you mean MPV?
No, MPD, new product development.
New product. Okay, new product development. Now, it just so happens. Okay, carry on.
No, but I think you were then going to talk about minimal viable product, weren't you? MVP.
Yes, that's what I thought
correct?
you were.
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were saying. Now, just before we start, carry on, just for the audience to have a look at some of the flavors, I just did a bit of research and I went into the local supermarket, and you're going to tell us about that later on. But here's one of your flavors. This is the Hawaiian, yeah?
Yeah.
And I've got another one, 3 cheese.
Margarita.
Excellent.
Good.
Yeah.
You've been filling your shopping basket, haven't you?
I've been doing my research, and we've the family's already eaten those pizzas, so we didn't need to worry about any wastage there. So that's cool. So okay, so you're telling me that when you kicked this off, you were really thinking to that extent. You had done your research. You were thinking, okay, let me choose a product that I know is going to be probably more viable than anything else. Had you really got into that amount of detail?
I mean, one of the ways that I think it's really good to start businesses is like a real incremental, iterative type process. And this comes back to that other acronym, MVP, minimal viable product.
Yeah.
And that's been, at the focus, at the center of both my first business, but particularly this business, because I didn't really have any background in food. As you know, we had run a restaurant for a very short period of time together back in the 80s. But apart from that, I had very little food experience. So I really needed to learn on, fast on my feet. So we started off, pretty small, making them in the restaurant that I owned at that time and just selling them to local shops. Lots of trials, making lots of errors and mistakes, getting things wrong. But because it was such a small business, essentially myself and my son, that we could make those things and what do they say? Fail quickly. Try things, fail, and then retry again. But we were convinced right from the start that pizza was the opportunity, and a great way of accessing. Because going back to the purpose, if we want people to eat more plant-based, we need to provide really fantastic tasting alternatives to their favorite foods. Now, that had to a great extent been done with things like ice cream, milk. It's getting there in terms of cheese, but no one had really done it with pizza. So we thought pizza was going to be the next big thing.
Right. Okay. So you mentioned the whole experience of creating food. Now, as you said, you did have a restaurant, but it must be a little bit tricky to come up with a pizza flavor and a dough that's just right for not just family use, but to be produced on a wholesale basis. So what was that like going through that process?
Well, probably we in terms of the production, we've been through the complete cycle. So, we literally started off making it by scratch, from scratch by hand in my own kitchen or in the restaurant kitchen. And, incredibly labor intensive, incredible time. Used a lot of time. And then after that, as the business group, we moved to having our own production unit, and that grew to having perhaps 10 people, operatives, still quite manual, but a little bit of a semi-automatic production process going on. But literally last year, we then took the final step and moved to a co-manufacturer, which was a difficult decision because it's really great making all your own stuff. But the key thing was that we needed consistency and capacity. And that was not going to happen in our own production unit. So a year ago, we closed that down and we took the final step, if you like, to go into a co-manufacturer in an automated pizza factory, actually over in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And that's it's given us a completely different outlook on the business and the business model. It's now much slimmer, leaner. Our overheads have stripped right down. It's fantastic to be able to say that we have this really high standard, top grade co-manufacturer with pretty much unlimited capacity.
Okay, well, that sounds great. Could we just jump back a few years, though? So there you are in your kitchen or in your restaurant making these pizzas by hand. And then you told us that you jumped then to about 10 operatives. There must have been some development from when you were just selling those pizzas in your restaurant. How did you get from there to having 10 operatives? Where were you selling the pizzas? Yeah. How did you build the brand, etc.?
Yeah. I mean, Joe, my son, really focuses on the marketing and the social media. So we knew right from the start that if we're going to compete with our very big, large competitors, because our main competitors are Dr. Oetker, Goodfellas, Chicago Town, who have massive factories, international pizza companies. The only way we could beat of taste and flavor and health. We'll perhaps talk about health later. But the main way we could beat them, which they couldn't replicate, would be the brand and the story. So right from the beginning, we decided to put myself and Joe at the forefront, literally on the pizza boxes. I guess we were looking at companies like Ben and Jerry's as an example, what they'd done 10 years earlier with ice cream, revolutionizing really the ice cream sector with their brand and their names and their faces being on the ice cream things. Mm-hmm. So we knew that needed to be key. And then in terms of developing the market, it really just did start incredibly local. There was 3 shops locally who were selling vegan food, and we just contacted them and convinced them to give the pizzas a go, and then used social media and some of our network contacts amongst plant-based and vegan groups in Norwich and Norfolk, where we're based, to tell them that these pizzas were now available. We had some launch events at the restaurants, so we invited a lot of influencers. And back then, the whole concept of influencers was only just really starting to develop, but we had perhaps half a dozen really good influencers in the Norwich Norfolk area. So we got them involved. We actually gave them small amounts of shares right in the early days. And then the final thing that's worth mentioning in terms of developing it was the crowdfunding, because we were the first plant-based company in Europe to equity crowdfund right at the beginning. Before we'd actually sold any pizzas, we did a crowdfunding campaign, albeit a very small one, on Cedars. And that just gave us an incredible profile and, marketing. So pretty much all stages of the business, the brand and the social media following has been bigger than the actual pizzas and number of pizzas being sold through stores.
Wow. So you went from, in the early days of social media, you started using social media in order to get your message out, build your brand. And that was obviously very new. What was that like for you at that point? Because I guess you're not a Gen Z. So what was it like? What was it like for you thinking about using social media. Was that, did you have to get your head around that? And were you...
Yeah, I guess so. And but we learned fairly quickly that it's all about being very, very real, very natural. So we did a lot of things focusing on myself and Joe, talking about the brand and product, going to people's houses. We ran competitions for me and Joe to go and cook pizzas in people's houses. So we were doing some quite unusual, sort of revolutionary guerrilla marketing type concepts to try and grab people's attention. And we started off with a few hundred. Instagram it still is our main social media channel. And, we started off with 1,000, and I think we're now at 50,000 followers on Instagram, which actually our social media following is bigger than Dr. Ocker, Chicago Town, and Goodfellas combined.
Wow. So you've been using that channel. Yeah. That's cool. Okay. So you were using new social media, guerrilla marketing type activities, but you were also doing a lot of stuff in the local community, using your restaurant as a platform, and you were out going to local festivals and events?
Yeah. Back then we did a lot more events and festivals and cooked pizzas fresh. The difficulty with doing that, and it was very successful and people loved the pizzas, but it was reaching a stage where lots of people knew the brand and wanted to get the pizzas, but they couldn't do because we didn't have the distribution and the point of sale network in place. So, but I still think it is probably better to do that as a small brand with limited finance and investment. That was something that we could do very cost effectively, create the story, get the following. And then it meant when we started, and at that stage, remember, we were at 3 shops. Regionally, we moved to 20 shops still within East Anglia, and we're still delivering direct. So Joe is in the van going and dropping his pizzas off at all of these shops ourselves. And that was the first probably 2 years. So we are talking quite organic, steady growth here. And then the next stage was to move to wholesalers or distributors.
And at what stage, you mentioned about the crowdfunding, at what stage was that? Was that very early on, or was that, that?
No, it's right at the beginning. Yeah, I mean, we literally had sold a handful of pizzas. So it was very much about selling the concept, selling the dream. Yes, there was a business plan behind it. The raise was only for a small amount, 20,000-30,000 pounds. But in those days, crowdfunding was a lot easier than it is now. The investment landscape has changed totally, and crowdfunding has become much more expensive than it was. So it was almost worthwhile doing from the marketing point of view, just doing that raise right at the beginning of the business.
Right. Okay. So the raise was not so much about raising the money; it was more about actually getting the profile. But were you aware of that at the time? Were you aware that that's what you were doing?
Yeah, I think so, because we knew that there was channels like Seeders and Crowdcube, the 2 largest crowdfunding companies in the UK. They do generate an awful lot of profile. They've got a lot of followers, and the general media picks up on what works and doesn't work on these crowdfunding platforms. So it was a great tool in the early days to just promote the business and get it out there.
Okay, fantastic. So you're getting your name out there locally through influencers on social media. You're using crowdfunding, and you've started to get your pizza distribution out across a number of different outlets. Where did that take us? Because obviously I'd imagine we're coming up now pretty close to the pandemic at 2020. Or did all of that happen a good few years before that, or? No,
probably, I think when in 2020, we were probably reasonably national in the UK. We didn't have any listing with a supermarket, but we had about 400 distribution points in total. Wow. And these were mainly small independent health food and whole food shops. And I think there was through one of our distributors or wholesalers, we were just going into some European countries as well. So a little bit of international presence. But then, as you say, the whole pandemic with people's shopping habits changing enormously. Fortunately, because as a food business, it didn't really affect our ability to get staff in to produce pizzas because we're seen as essential workers. So we could keep the factory on and produce the pizzas, but a lot of our shops weren't getting the footfall in because they were having to do home deliveries and there was a lot of closures and stuff. So then we certainly did need to look at what we could do to pivot the business and change.
Okay, and what did you do at that point then?
So I guess the key thing was we've been playing around with D2C, direct to consumer, but not really putting too much time and effort into it. So we were lucky that we already had our shop up and running. So people could go on there, choose various pizza bundles, 4, 8, 10, different flavors. And then we would put them together in an insulated box with dry ice and send them out via a courier, sort of next day delivery. So we just put a lot more time and effort into that and spent a bit more money marketing wise on focusing on that D2C route. And it worked pretty well. I mean, it tripled, quadrupled during those year or two of lockdown, etc. And it moved away from it. Was one stage it was 10%, and at its height it was 30-40% of our business was doing that D2C.
Wow! So in actual fact, the pandemic, rather than being a retrograde issue for you, actually moved your business forward. It sounds like.
Yeah, it did, and I think what it did in the short term, it allowed a lot of people who didn't have a shop which sold our pizzas close by to access the pizza. So it introduced them to them, which was it was a good preparation for our first supermarket listing, which gave us much better nationwide coverage because a lot of people had tried it through the online shop and delivered to home, but it wasn't sustainable. I mean, two things I guess happened towards. First of all, obviously COVID ended and people moved away, particularly from getting frozen food delivered because there's some cost and hassle involved in delivering frozen to home as opposed to ambient, which is a lot easier. And then secondly, after the COVID, we actually bizarrely, we move into the Ukraine war, and the price of dry ice suddenly goes up 5 or 6-fold. And
oh my goodness!
And that just wiped out all of the profits because we needed the dry ice to keep the pizzas frozen. We needed the pizzas to arrive frozen because people don't buy 4 or 8 pizzas and get through it in the next week or two unless they're really keen on pizzas. They need to put them straight into their freezer. So that it was really interesting how for 2 years really focused on D2C, and then pretty much pandemic ended, Ukrainian war, unintended consequences. The cost of dry ice just was, not only did it just massively increase, but it was so variable from week to week that we just didn't know what it was going to cost when we ordered our big pallets of dry ice. They couldn't tell us how much it was going to cost until it was delivered. So impossible way to run a business. So it was really useful for those 2 years. And I think it did introduce a lot of people to the business, but we gave us probably 6 months after the Ukrainian war, we had to give up the D2C because it was just unviable.
And what was that like then? How did you feel? You'd gone through several years of development. You'd built up your brand. You had this much better distribution, and you'd go through the pandemic. You come out the other end of the pandemic thinking, fantastic, I've now got physical distribution and we've got online. How are you feeling at that point when you realized, oh my God, the Ukraine war is actually setting us back?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, I'm sure many small business owners have felt that for the last 3 or 4 years, that it does feel it's one thing after another. And you just want some stability, don't you? And to know what's going to happen. And it's incredible to think that something that's happening thousands of miles off has an impact on a small pizza business trying to deliver its frozen pizzas to its consumers. But I guess we were fortunate that at that time, that was when we were cutting back on the D2C, the direct to consumer. That was when we were just having our initial conversations with ASDA, our first supermarket listing in the UK. So we were fortunate that we didn't have a long spell where one part of the business was getting decimated and there wasn't any light at the end of the tunnel. And that's really, when the business then changed and moved away from the focus being on growing that independent network around the country to starting to focus, okay, well, if we want real coverage, we need to get into those UK multiples, and ASDA was the first one that came along.
And I think you're almost sidestepping a little bit, but how did you cope with that? How did you cope mentally, psychologically with that up down over that period? Because I guess there must be some people who are setting up in business now thinking, well, oh my goodness, I mean that sounds horrendous. How are you coping with that?
I suppose for personally, my attitude has always been not to get too carried away with the successes, and then when you have the challenges, you don't get that high and low. So trying to keep it feet on the ground and steady. I think it really helped that we had some supportive investors, because ultimately, as a food business is growing, you're going to go through many years when you're not making money. You are losing money as the business scales and grows, and you do need investors that are supportive and patient. And we've been fortunate that we had some good investors, so who understood the challenges that the business was facing, all these consistent challenges. So that sort of made it easier. But yeah, I mean, some of the times I was working with my son Joe, and I had another business, which was still bringing in some income and coming towards the end of my career, and thinking about what I was going to do, after these two businesses. Joe was really at the beginning and investing all his time and effort into this business. So that probably added a little bit more pressure than if I'd been doing it just by myself, because I was worried about Joe and the other staff as well. And obviously, as you grow a business and you get more staff on board, for example, at our peak, we had a management team of 6 or 7, but with the way the business has changed now, it's down to 3. So, that's tough as well, because you're taking people on board, trying to grow fast, getting investment, and then if you suddenly change the way the business is running, you just don't need those people and you have to let them go.
Okay. And you're saying that the way that you dealt with that yourself personally was not getting too high when things are going well, and therefore not being too low when times are tough. And it sounds like you were saying you were leaning on your investors for support in order to keep at it. What did you have any other tricks, any other psychological, emotional tricks that you used to keep yourself in the game? I guess.
For me, I do meditate, and it's interesting with meditation that the times that you feel least like doing it are the times you most need it, even if it's only a short period of time. But I suppose the other thing for me is being active, and physically active. And I just find, and Joe is finding this as well, that's one of the things that keeps you sane. Regular gym sessions, swimming, biking, running, whatever it is. You really just, if you've got that habit instilled into your lifestyle, then there's probably no greater stress breaker than that. And always been into my training, my physical activities, so that's been one constant. I can't imagine going through the stresses and turmoils of running the business if you didn't have your morning workouts and your evening runs to focus on. So I think that it doesn't sound psychological, but it really is. It's impact. Yes, obviously there's physical health benefits, but the psychological ones are almost more important to me.
Well, I think that's a really big message, and I'm sure there'll be lots of people who, when they watch this podcast, hopefully will get that as a really clear message, that when you're going through tough times, if you can go out and do physical things to keep the blood pumping around your your body and take your focus, I guess, off of the challenges. And that interesting point you made at the beginning about meditation. There probably won't be as many entrepreneurs or business owners out there who have come across the meditation thing. How do you do that? What's involved in your meditation? If you don't mind saying a few.
No. I mean, I've done different things over the years, so I'm not stuck with one thing. And the meditation that I'm currently doing is almost going back to what I started doing 20, 30 years ago, which is a Buddhist chant type meditation. So it's an Om type meditation. But I guess what I had been doing prior to that was really good and really helped as well. And that was breath work, and specifically Wim Hof type breath work. So Wim Hof, as some people may know, is the Iceman, Dutch guy who's into cold water submersion. But another part of his practice that he focuses on is a meditation through breath work, and it's a series of deep forced breaths followed by a holding of breath, which has all sorts of benefits, as well as calming the mind. It stimulates a lot of different things in the brain as well, and I found that really worked. I've moved away from that now and back to the Buddhist sort of Om chanting, and I think I just find that I move between different things just as I discover them, whatever feels right at the time, but always trying to do something, most days, but not beating yourself over the head if you don't do it.
And could you say anything about the creativity benefits at all? Because I know a lot of people attest to when they meditate, when they do exercise, when they just chill out away from their business. Is there anything that you could say that you've experienced as a result of those practices that have actually helped you proactively think about and run your business?
I suppose it's that classic thing about being managing the not being in the business but on it, so giving yourself time away to think about things. And I do find that my best thinking comes when I'm out running or biking, usually by myself. And it's interesting depending on the activity. Some activities are very good at keeping you in the moment. So, for example, the analogy I'd always use would be biking. So if you go out on a mountain bike in a forest, then you've got to pay attention to the bike ride. Otherwise, you're going to hit a branch and come off. So you can't drift away. You can't think of other stuff. That's bringing you to the moment, which is great because you're not thinking about other stuff. But if you're out on a road bike and you've got a nice straight road and and there's no obstructions, then you can afford to have this sort of thinking going on whilst you're doing your physical activity. And there's definitely a connection between physical activity and blood and energy being pumped around the body and having the ability to think more creatively and clearly. And even things like these days, walking meetings. A lot of people are discovering now, and a lot of companies are taking on board, let's get away from this desk, let's go out as a group or as a couple and walk and talk. So yeah, definitely the I don't know where you're standing at your moment, aren't you? I
Yes.
have got my standing desk, but I'm sitting down at the moment because I had a gym session this morning. But I'm with you. I'm on most of the time. I'm on my standing desk, and I just find it's that link which we've known since university days between mind, body, soul, spirit, isn't it? That it's the holistic approach. And if you want to have your best creative thoughts for your business, then how do you keep active? How do you give yourself those moments of respite, doing hopefully something that you love, but will have spin-off benefits for your business, definitely.
Wow. Well, I think that's a big message. Thank you for that, Mike. I'm sure people will get a lot of value out of what you've done. Now, let's just quickly go back to the story. So we get to the pandemic. We start having the Ukraine war. And at that point, was that when you were about to get your listings within ASDA for the first time?
Yeah. Yeah, so we came across an incubator scheme which ASDA had set up, and we applied for that. And the incubator schemes are all about taking small challenger brands and helping them on their first steps into multiples, into large supermarkets. And that must have been about 2 years ago that we got accepted onto that scheme. And that was going to give us access to only 120 ASDA stores. And in a particular section, it was an incubator section. So we weren't sitting with all the other frozen pizzas. We were with 2 or 3 other frozen products that were also on this incubator scheme. And they were put in weird and wonderful places around the shop, wherever they could find the space, and then promoted as and most of the supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, have their own initiatives where they're trying to encourage small brands to get into the store.
Now, the way that you tell that story, it sounds like, you just one day you decided to join an incubator scheme. My guess is it was a little bit more difficult than that. How did you get into that incubator scheme? Because I remember before you got into ASDA, it was a big journey. It was a big challenge. Getting into the supermarkets. So how did you open that door, and then how did you get in there and have them take you on board?
I mean, it's still incredibly challenging and difficult to deal with these big businesses, because what we're increasingly finding is that the way they look at it, they just have limited space, whether it be in chilled, frozen, ambient, and they want to stay with the proven bestsellers and with the companies going to give them least hassle and spend the most money with them in marketing. And so pretty much all the advantages are with the bigger companies, because they're already in there, they've got established supply chains, they've got big marketing budgets, and it's all very smooth and seamless. So it's a lot of hassle for a big organization to onboard a small business. So you've really got to give them a big reason for doing that. You've got to really do your research on let's take ASDA as an example, what ASDA are trying to achieve, what are the things that are going to press their buttons in terms of, yes, the food and the product and the range that they've got, but also are there particular environmental, social, governance type stuff or corporate aims that you can say, look, we can help contribute to these in a way that your existing brands can't. And it is exactly that. It's going in, looking at what they've currently got in, for us, the frozen vegan pizza. We've recently had a conversation with another multiple, and we analysed the other 4 flavours and brands that they had and said what their strengths and weaknesses were, and then did a comparison with what our strengths and weaknesses were to show that we were bringing more to the party than any of those other brands. And in terms of opening the doors, one of the things, you've just got to get this most recent conversation we had last week with one of the UK multiples, that came about as a result of Joe doing a LinkedIn, real guerrilla marketing LinkedIn campaign, and standing outside the supermarket's head office with a sign saying, let us in, come in one of the pizza boxes that you've got, and then putting that out on LinkedIn and asking everyone to tag the supermarket name.
Right.
And so they had 200 or 300 people all tagging their name, and eventually we got contacted by one of their senior bosses saying, and it was almost like, all right, lads, I'll hold my hands up, I give in, I'm going to give you a meeting with one of my buyers.
Wow.
And at that meeting, the buyer actually said, well, some people in the business didn't appreciate your marketing campaign, but hats off to you for 10 out of 10 for effort.
Wow.
So whilst it was interesting, once they actually saw it as a hassle, because they were getting all these messages on LinkedIn, but it did bring them to the table.
Wow. So just spinning quickly back to ASDA, you actually had a sales strategy, and that strategy, it sounds like, was pinpointing the gaps that they had from a purpose branding perspective, and filling that gap with what you could bring to the table?
Yeah. So take for example, our main competitors that I keep quoting. None of them talk about being a healthier pizza, and none of them talk about the impact on the planet. So yes, we all talk about taste and flavor, and we all want to be the best on that. But if we can say, look, we can match them on taste and flavor, but with 30% less salt, 50% less saturated fat, our pizzas are what they call high fat, salt, sugar compliant. So there's some government legislation which identifies HFSS, high fat, salt, sugar foods. And every pizza apart from ours is high fat, salt, sugar. And we aren't high fat, salt, sugar because the way we make our pizzas. So that's a health tick against us, which no one else at the moment can do. We're the first pizza range to do carbon rating. So we know what our carbon emissions are. And we know they're 30-40% less than the meat and dairy pizzas. Now, all of that stuff, so we can go tick, tick, tick on several things which none of their other pizzas can. But you've still got to match them on taste, or be better than them on taste,
right?
Because otherwise, the people there's only a small percentage of shoppers that will what's the word? They will mitigate.
Right, yeah. They'll make a purchase. Yeah, they'll make a purchase in spite of the fact that it maybe doesn't taste as good. Yeah, I've got it.
Yeah, we need to really take that out and say, look, they all taste really good. So why didn't you go for us? Because we've got all these other advantages.
And how did you overcome that perception then, that potential negative perception that plant-based food is not as tasty as the real thing?
I mean, we do a lot of taste or challenges. So one of the social media things we do is go out and do taste sessions with general members of the public, and not tell them it's vegan pizza,
right?
And then see what their reaction is after it. So we do stuff like that. On the box, the biggest problem with vegan pizza is the cheese, getting a cheese that melts and is stretchy and tastes as good as the dairy cheese. So the box focuses quite a lot on the cheese side of things. And then the other thing we do is, so the flavors that we've got, two of them have got fake meats on. So the Hawaiian's got ham, and the let's go see.
Oh, bless you.
Bless me. Sorry about that.
Bless you, my son.
So we've got the ham and we've got the pepperoni, and we spend a long time finding the best ham and the pepperoni, or pepperoni as we call it, to make sure that it's as close as it can be to the meat alternatives. Because the most popular pizza flavor is pepperoni, and so we need to that's our hero product, if you like. That's the one that most shops will take first of all.
I see. So you had to convince the buyers that you had a product that was actually as tasty as the mainstream products out there. And did you do that by actually bringing your pizzas along and giving them a taste, or from all
most of the retailers and distributors and wholesalers, they'll all obviously taste the product before they'll agree to list you. And sometimes that's done remotely. You just send it to them, they cook them up and try them. Other times you can actually go along, and they all have kitchens, development kitchens, where you can go in and actually cook them up and serve them to them. Although interestingly, I think once you're established, so we're in supermarket, in ASDA, we've got a good rate of sale. We've been in there for a year and a half. So when you're going and talking to another supermarket, that actually them testing it themselves becomes less important, because it's already being proven out there in the marketplace.
Got you. So that whole process of the incubation at ASDA and getting a listing, was that another stressful period?
I mean, it was an exciting period, because obviously it's what we had been working for. And I think the only thing that made it stressful really was that pretty much all these big supermarkets, they struggle to, because we're only a small part of what they do, that you don't get much time, you don't get much focus, and things tend to go wrong, things get delayed. So it's that that classic situation of a small business where it's massively important to you, but it's only of minor importance to them. So you're spending all your time and effort and focus on getting back to them quickly and doing everything on time, and you're just a small piece in their jigsaw, aren't you? So that's the challenge, is getting used to something that you're all over being a relatively minor thing for them.
Okay, so you get through that whole process, you manage to get a listing, and that's then been distributed out through a number of ASDA stores.
Yeah, so initially 120.
And were you able to supply the requirements of ASDA from your own factory, or was that the point where you had to start?
No, at that stage we had our own production unit, and it took us a long time, because the ASDA order would be X number of pallets, and we could only produce a small number of pallets each day. So we were having to get new staff on and try and semi-automate some of the production line, because it was a doubling of the business in one listing, if you like. So that did really put some strains on that whole production side of things.
And of course, from what you've told us, that wasn't something that you were expert in at that point. No,
neither myself or Joe had background in food production. And food production of pizzas is very different to working as a chef in a restaurant.
Yeah.
Because it's one or two products. It's all about consistency and no variability. And also as you move from being supplying into small independent stores up to supermarkets, multiples, then you have to reach higher levels of food safety certification. So you start getting external audits coming in, and you have to up your game in terms of that whole health and safety.
And how did you deal with that? How did you manage that new learning? Because that sounds like a whole. Yeah. I mean, there are people who clearly spend their whole lives just specializing in getting good at that, and here you are having to do it.
Well, eventually, within a few months, we did take on board a production manager. So that was one of our sort of key appointments when we got the ASDA listing, was to get someone on board who had that experience and expertise and could just focus on managing the production side of things.
So you filled the gap by employing somebody who had that expertise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what was the next stage? So we're getting pretty close to being up to date now. So this was a year and a half ago.
Yeah, a year and a half ago. I suppose since then, the ASDA incubator scheme finished, and we'd achieved enough in terms of our rate of sale, which is the number of pizzas sold per week per store, for us to get a more extensive general listing with one SKU, one single key unit is what we call a pizza, a SKU. Mm-hmm. So we've now been in about 350 to 400 ASDA stores with that single SKU, the pepperoni. And at the same time, it was a year ago that we made that decision I mentioned earlier about realizing that we just couldn't keep doing our own production. So that was been a big change, I suppose, closing down the production unit, having to make people redundant, unfortunately, and at the same time streamline the management team. We didn't need a production manager. Mm-hmm. We didn't actually need a marketing manager, so we had to lose 2 senior management posts, bring our overheads right down, and move the production out to this co-manufacturer in Eindhoven, so we're making less margin on each pizza we sell, but our overheads are about 25% of what they were a year and a half ago.
Wow. So you've cut your overheads by 75%?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. If you look at all of the overheads, because the management team at one stage was 6 or 7, and we've gone down to 3. And then all of the overheads associated, we haven't got an office, we haven't got a production unit, Our storage is much simplified. And we've sort of reduced down the number of customers that we've got. So we're trying to now focus on, half a dozen key clients and making them really work. And it's getting to the stage now where it's all about, the early stages of food business is about growth, and margin isn't so important. It's about grabbing market share and increasing brand awareness. And I think now we're moving into that next stage where it's still about that, but it is also important that you're achieving enough of a margin to hit break even and then go onwards into profitability.
Okay. And we're getting pretty close to the hour mark now. So let me just ask a few closing questions. If you were to have your time again, if you look back over the last 5-6 years from when you started, if you could go back in time and speak to young Mike and young Joe when you were kicking off, is there anything that you would say to them, any advice you would give them with regard to what you would do differently?
Yeah, I think probably there's three things. First of all, I would focus more on fewer core products, because it's so easy to get carried away of creating weird and wonderful flavors, and that sort of did a job, particularly when we were doing the D2C, the direct to consumer. It was great to have monthly specials and partnerships, and all of that stuff did help build up brand awareness and following on social media. And then I think the second, just be really careful about employing people to do things yourself, because it is a big commitment as compared to outsourcing it and finding someone who's more flexible to deliver it for you. So marketing, it'd be, do you employ a marketing manager or director with the salary and the on cost and the commitment, or do you outsource that to someone that it's much easier to flex their hours and contract, etc. And then I think the final one is making the product. I think we should have looked much earlier for a production partner rather than move into that production unit and carried on producing the pizzas for 2 or 3 years in that production unit, because it's been a bit of a revelation now we don't have the production unit, how much we can focus on the part of the business that we're really good at and leave that production side of things to the specialists over in Eindhoven.
But I guess those last two parts, in a way, perhaps you couldn't really have known that unless you'd had a background in food production and all the supply chain stuff. No.
So I'm not. I'm not saying we should have known that.
Yeah.
But the question was, what do you wish you would have known? And if we were starting again, or if we were giving advice to another business.
Yeah.
Because we've actually raised, over the years, we've raised a reasonable amount of funding through several rounds of investment. And it's really interesting to look back and think, well, where's that money gone and how much use was it? And I would certainly, if we were given that same amount of money again, I would use it in different ways.
And from what I've taken from that, probably the biggest part is outsourcing as much as you can until you, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Until you're absolutely certain of the benefits of bringing it in-house. Because, a lot of the plant-based brands that we know that are struggling and got a lot of challenges at the moment use their investment rounds to take on board, a lot of staff, a lot of senior managers on big salaries. And when things get tough, they're the first things that have to go.
And what's fascinating about
when you
what's fascinating about that is that's exactly what was happening in the tech industry. And probably always happens in the tech industry. As soon as a tech company raises a big chunk of cash, one of the first things it does, gets big offices and employs lots of people. And it's generally those companies that don't do that and go as quickly as possible for a break even. Let's try and get to break even as quickly as possible, that tend to survive when there's downturns.
Yeah, because that sort of approach is fine while the investment landscape is still positive.
Yeah.
But as soon as something like the pandemic and then various wars break out, it's the valuations of some businesses, and including our own, has gone down 50, 75% in the last 2 years.
Wow.
So if you were raising at your business valuation of 5 million, 2 or 3 years ago, the chances are you're going out at 1.5 million now.
Yeah, that's very hard. That's a very, very difficult.
And of course, the big thing is interest rates as well. Investors are saying, well, why should we, if I can get 5% by just sitting it in a bank or buying a bond, why should I take the risk? Whereas when they were getting 0.5 or 1%, then it's much more worthwhile than taking a risk, isn't it?
Yeah, makes complete sense. Okay, so coming up for about 60 minutes now. Last question. What's the future for you guys?
Well, I mean, the exciting conversations have happened in the last few weeks have been around the next 1 or 2 UK multiples. That's our key focus because it's a little bit easier to get into your second and third once you've been in your first. So hopefully in the next 6 months, we will on board with 2 more of the UK multiples. And then I guess the second area of expansion is internationally, that we're in got reasonable good coverage in the Netherlands, but we need to try and work out the pricing, the marketing, the business model that works to get us into some of the other bigger European countries. But international expansion, particularly for a frozen product, is difficult these days because logistics, transport costs, freezer, refrigeration costs have gone up quite high.
Wow.
So it's incredible how much of the business is really about about logistics. You can have an amazing product and it can sell really well in the shops, but it's that bit in the middle about how do you efficiently, move it around the country and move it around Europe or the world. That's been a bit of an eye-opener how important logistics are to a business.
Wow, that's incredible. And last question then, what's the future for you as a business alchemist? When you think it like, the definition of that as being like, basically, I guess you're an entrepreneur. Have you got to the end of your entrepreneurial career, or do you still have other ideas that you want to create and bring into the world?
Yeah, I guess the challenge for me over the next year or two is to bring my workload and effort in these 2 existing businesses down a little, and make my input to them even smarter by getting the right people in place, in post, incentivized, motivated, excited about the businesses. So with One Planet, to gradually hand over more to Joe. For the other business, we've got a succession plan in place with a future MD on board for the last year or 2 who's doing fantastic stuff. So, and then I've my sort of semi-retirement plan is to really do something I've dreamt of for many years now, and that's to buy some land abroad and do a small plant-based retreat with some biking and running and stuff like that. And so, it will be another business, but it will be certainly much more of a lifestyle business, something that I enjoy doing, fairly small scale, very people orientated, and if it can wash its face whilst I'm still doing a day a week on the other 2 businesses, then that's my ideal sort of scenario in a day or 2. Not a day or 2, in a year or 2.
Yeah. Well, that sounds amazing. It sounds like you've got this alchemy thing in your blood, and it sounds like you really love it. So fantastic. Is there any other last piece of advice you would like to give to any potential entrepreneur alchemists who are thinking, should I take the plunge? Should I go out there and set up my own business? Are there any other bits of advice that you would like to get out there?
I'd like to come back to what we talked about earlier, that concept of minimal viable product, of MVP, and this concept of MVP, minimal viable product.
Yeah.
So what's that? And this concept of failing fast as well, I think, is really, really interesting and powerful. I think one of the reasons procrastinate and talk about setting up their own business and never get around to it is that they build it up and they increase the risk and the downside in their mind. And I would just encourage anyone to think about how can you test whatever your idea is in incremental ways and build up slowly. So, don't wait until you achieve, something that's close to perfect. Get your product or service the best you can for a smallest amount of money in a reasonable amount of time, and test it and trial it. Because the chances are that if you don't do that and you spend, several years and spend a load of money on something, it's still going to need changing and adapting anyway. So you might as well find out what those issues are as early as possible without wasting time and money, and then making the changes. So when I speak to entrepreneurs and people that are thinking about, say, business, that's the biggest barrier, really. And it is incredibly difficult. I was lucky the first time I set up my business, I'd fallen out with a boss. I was invited to leave with a bit of a golden handshake, and that gave me an easy way out, really. It gave me 6-12 months to set up a business. But it is, once the longer you're in a salaried situation, you build up mortgages, you may have kids, other people that dependent on you, it becomes increasingly difficult. So I guess that leads on to the second bit of advice is, if you can try it while you're young, then, like we did, as soon as we came out of university, we set up a business, our first vegan restaurant, 6 months to set it up, 6 months to fail. But, we learned so much from that, probably more than we did in 3 years at Loughborough University in terms of business and entrepreneurship. So, I guess they're the key things I'd try and get over, Phil.
Right there. That's great advice. So, Mike, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure people will get a lot of excitement and motivation from what you've achieved. If they want to get hold of your pizzas, where can they get them?
Yeah, most ASDAs, probably about 2/3 of ASDAs, and any good quality independent whole food or health food shop, as long as it's got a freezer cabinet, chances are they should have them. If they haven't got them, then ask them, because they'll definitely be using a wholesaler or distributor that can get it into stock for them.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like you're not doing the online service anymore.
No more D2C at the moment. The cost of the dry ice is too high still.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so it's ASDA or local whole food retail stores in the country.
Yeah, if they go to our website, www.oneplanetpizza.com, we've got a list of all of those stockists there.
That's fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all the best in your future journeys, and look forward to hearing more about your business alchemy in the future.
It's been a pleasure, Phil. Great to talk to you.
And you. Take care. Bye-bye now.